Well, greetings all. Welcome to the podcast where the question for today is how much and how often can we safely ignore poetry? It's a real question, and we're going to fearlessly delve into it. So I hope you'll stick around for some new poems and new commentary on this new slant or on this slant of how much poetry we can safely ignore, which means you are listening to Poetry, Gossip, and the Pursuit of Pleasure with Dale Byron. That's me. That's me. And this is a place where we look at the practical side of poetry, where we use poetry and poems in new creative ways in our lives, where we try to, sort of open up little pockets of joy and sanity and connectedness. Yes, we're going to be doing all of that and more. So, this week's episode is, of course, as we've already said, how to safely ignore poetry. And, it seems to me that it's perfectly fine to ignore poetry. It was some of the thoughts I had about this week's podcast. We can do that most of the time. In fact, that will actually make you average and normal if you ignore poetry. However, if you learn to almost, or as we're going to say today, to safely ignore just the right amount of poetry, but not completely, you can get many of its secrets and its not so secret benefits that we talk about here all the time without wasting too much of your time, and without being tagged an unproductive person. Oh, how terrible. Or a weirdo that loves poetry too much and too often. So this week, I want to feature several recently found new poems new to me, not in some cases, not new poets, but new poems, but that poems that I could have hardly ignored from my perspective. Or I guess I could have, but what would I have given up in terms of insight, in terms of delight, in terms of understanding, inspiration, and maybe even survival? We're going to dig into all that. But before I get into our found new poems, the ones that I have, all these are totally new to me. Let me start with one that apparently has been lurking inside me, which, as you'll see, is actually the genesis for today's topic and podcast. So here is my poem, or whatever you want to call it. And I did call it the same title as the podcast today, which is How to Safely Ignore Poetry. Goes like this, little thing I've written just in the last few weeks. Most people are successful at ignoring poetry. Most people are successful at ignoring poetry. Have you noticed? Except maybe those little ditties we receive in birthday cards and the like. Some people talk about poems as strange, rarefied things with their images, short lines, and allusions, and the oddly decided metaphors. Yes, those too. Maybe we simply don't know what to call it. I just call them words that grab our attention, stories without the boring parts, as poet William Stafford once said. I especially love poems with little stories or essays inside and that delight. The best poems sneak up on us, fly under the radar screen of our strategic mind, directly to the heart, to fill it, to break it, to heal it, to transcend the tensions of yes and no, of beauty and bleakness, of terror and love. Listen, listen, if you like one, the words I mean, the way they sometimes gather in little self-organized cul-de-sacs of sound and meaning that get us deeper, deeper than we've ever gotten. Well, then I say, call it whatever you want. Call it whatever you want. Then place it under a newspaper, hidden, or a coffee cup, or even at the bottom of a laundry bag, lost, but lurking where you can't help but occasionally find it again and be reminded. Really, anywhere you can pretend to ignore poems, as most will do, but secretly, you and I, will know what is real. Yes, we will love and we will feel things. Then who knows what might happen next? Listen, listen. If you like one, we're talking about a poem here. Listen, if you like one, the words I mean, the words I mean, the way they sometimes gather in little organized cul-de-sacs of sound and meaning that get us deeper than we've ever been gotten. Well, then I say, call it whatever you want. Call it whatever you want, then place it under a newspaper hidden, or a coffee cup, or even at the bottom of the laundry bag, lost but lurking where you can't help but occasionally find it again and be reminded. Really, really, anywhere you can pretend to ignore poems, as most will do. But secretly, you and I will know what is real. Yes, we will love and we will feel things. Then who knows what might happen next? Well, so that was the genesis for the idea behind this poem. And as you know, I'm having a little playful paradoxical moment because I'm saying that you can certainly ignore poems. I'm saying, of course, that you will be in the norm. You will be average, in other words, if you ignore poems completely, even. But what do we give up if we don't delve in a little bit? And you don't have to be as hooked on poetry as perhaps I am or somebody else is. It's not a matter, it's not a contest, it's not a competition. But I guess what I'm saying, and what I'm saying in this whole podcast, what I've been saying with large parts of my life over the last 30-ish years, is that there is poetry that if we don't ignore it, that there are incredible gifts there for us. So let's talk about some examples of some recent gifts that I've found that I want to share with you today. This one is a poem by Sherry Shinoda, and I've not known about her poetry before, which I can't believe, and certainly not known about this particular poem, but let's delve into it. It's called Topsoil in Repentance. Topsoil in Repentance by the poet Sherry Shinoda. On my mind daily, with the insistence of Metronomus, is that thin, granular layer, rich humus, spare humility, black earth daily lifted and blown into the Gulf of Mexico. Thinnest of salvations, with a margin of air, wide as the pink gelatinous body of the earthworm, which my spade barely misses. And every time my tines enter the ground, and every time my tines, you know those things with a pitchfork? And every time my tines enter the ground, my wrist twists the damp loam. I love that little internal rhyme there. The wrist twists the damp loam. I breathe easier to see them wriggling, unburied, fleeing the light, burrowing back down, aerating this earth we have packed down with our culpability. This immense density of earth, only the topmost of which can support the unimaginable numbers of us, our great warm swarm. Squinting up in immense sunlight, I hear the silent swish. I hear the silent swish and tick and back and forth rhythm the last few seconds before midnight. The enormity of the lone, which has been called in full, the hazy buzzing of the furry bees, busy, busy in the branches above my exposed neck, on any given day, a stay, on any given day, a stay for a little while longer of execution. Squinting up in immense sunlight, I hear the silent swish and tick, the back and forth rhythm, the last few seconds before midnight, the enormity of the lone, which has been called in full, the hazy buzzing of the furry bees, busy, busy in the branches above my exposed neck, on any given day, a stay for a little while longer of execution. Well, wow. The poet is also a pediatrician and poet. So you know that she has a to-do list which probably looks really intense. And you know, because she's a writer, a prolific writer, an award-winning writer, that she values the art of poetry, values its writing, its reading, values writing as a process. You just know that about her. And I've read a little bit about her biography, so I know it more specifically. And, you know, when I read this poem, it made me think that I have, over the last year or so, been very interested in what's been called the meta crisis, or the environmental overshoot crisis, which involves everything from climate change to soil to ocean to all the problems that we all know, to extinctions and forest destruction, just on and on and on. That's why it's called a meta crisis. But what's interesting is that I love to approach it through a poem like this. And obviously she's talking about soil and the problems with soil, and also loving soil, all the way down to the tiniest details, the earthworms moving soil in her garden with her pitchfork tines. So she's talking about something very, very specific and elemental, and vastly huge at the same time that she's talking about the micro example of what happens in her own garden. And I love that. It's dizzying, it's wonderful, it tugs at the heart, and it's a different way to get at the ecological challenges we have, other than just the strategic ideas. As I've said before many times, the strategic ideas are incredibly important. The science, the empirical data is incredibly important. But as I've also said many times before, if we leave the heart behind, if we make it only about the head, if we leave the emotions and the heart and the imagery behind, we will leave something critical behind. And in fact, my own theory is we will never make the difficult changes we're going to need to make as human beings, as cultures, as nations, if we don't include the heart. And I think this poem, the hazy buzzing of the furry bees busy in the branches, just the music and the images of this poem helps bring the heart along, I think. I think it does. So there's one little thing not to ignore. So let's keep cooking. I've got another poem, totally different subject. Well, I don't know. I guess this is about grief. So there were parts of that poem talking about the ecological changes, the huge crisis that we are facing. I guess obviously that's about grieving as well. But this poem is specifically called Grief. That's the title, by Richard Brostoff. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. It's called Grief. And I can't say this enough, by the way. All the poets that I bring on this podcast, I encourage you, seek out their work, find out who they are. If you love the poem, then probably you'll love other poems they've written. So seek them out. These folks are available on the internet, of course, through their books. You may be able to see them speak in person. Go do that. Go do that. Support poets and support poetry. So this poem called Grief, Richard Brostoff. Somewhere in the Sargasso Sea, the water disappears into itself, hauling an ocean in. Vortex, vortex, how you repeat a single gesture. Come round to find only yourself, a cup full of questions. Perhaps some curl of wisdom, perhaps some curl of wisdom, a bit of flung salt. You hold an absence at your center. You hold an absence at your center as if it were a life. Somewhere in the Sargasso Sea, the water disappears into itself, hauling an ocean in, hauling an ocean in. Vortex, vortex, how you repeat a single gesture. Come round to find only yourself, a cup full of questions. Perhaps some curl of wisdom, a bit of flung salt. You hold an absence. You hold an absence at your center as if it were a life. You know, grief comes in all different flavors. There's no one way to do it. However, sometimes there's a way in which a really skillful poem, a good poem, and I would say this is one, talking about grief, can come at it as Emily Dickinson once said, in a slant way. And because when we're really hurting, when we're really grieving, sometimes there's so much pain, there's so much coming at us that we need this slant way so that we can get a little bit of centeredness around the feeling, so that the sorrow and the grieving can actually come in deeper in a way, because it's coming in a slant fashion, and we can actually feel it even more, so that our healing is perhaps enhanced just a little bit. Now, you know, a personal note, I've had a number of people pass out of my life in certainly the last 3 or 4 years. When my dad died about 5 years ago, my sister about 4 years ago, around 4 years ago, and one of the teachers, my main Aikido teacher, Wendy Palmer, just died about, earlier this month. This is December of 2022, almost New Year's. And she died just at the beginning of this month. So, and that doesn't make me special or anything. Unfortunately, not. It doesn't make me special because we're all faced with loss of loved ones, loss of friends, loss of dear ones, loss of colleagues, in addition to other losses that we deal with, of course. So I would say that having tools for grieving would be a good thing. And poems, I think, are one of those tools. So, what would be the opportunity cost of ignoring this poem? Well, for me, right now in my life, because there is grieving and loss that's so fresh for me, and there's been, a fair amount of it in my life over the last 5 years, that there would be a great opportunity cost had I not found this poem. Ah, and yes, you do. You hold an absence at your center. You hold an absence at your center as if it were a life. That's what we do. Okay, let's move on to another new poem, new for me. This is called Out to Play by Brian Andreas. Brian Andreas, Out to Play. Very short poem like the one I just read. Out to Play. No hurt survives. No hurt survives for long. No hurt survives for long without our help, she said. No hurt survives for long without our help, she says. You ever notice how a really good poem, and particularly a short poem, will jump right into the deep end of the pool? I mean, just immediately. We are instantly into the story, instantly into the narrative, instantly into the images, and in some cases, the deep feelings. No hurt survives for long. No hurt survives for long without our help, she said. And then she kissed me and sent me out. And then she kissed me and sent me out to play again for the rest of my life. Isn't it amazing how even a very short, minimal number of words poem like this, you can step inside, we can step inside and go on a journey which could be immense. And I think in this case, it is immense. I mean, I don't know. It seems to be his mom, or it seems to be somebody, maybe some other adult figure in his life, that gave such wisdom. No hurt survives. No hurt survives, says the protagonist in this poem. No hurt survives for long, without our help, she said. Isn't that so true? Isn't that so true? Somebody says, we have grief, we have hurt, we have pain, and yet the suffering that is created, especially long suffering, we have to conspire in that as well. Now, I'm not judging it. I'm not saying I haven't done it myself. I'm not in the middle of it, probably, for sure, in my life. This right now. I mean, maybe not this instant, but certainly now in my life. I am doing that. And we do that to ourselves. And we need to have empathy for ourselves because we do that to ourselves. But if we get a little altitude on it from time to time to go, then we can step out of so much suffering. And perhaps even though we have the loss, we have the grieving, we don't have to conspire against ourselves. No hurt survives for long without our help, she said. And then she kissed me and sent me out to play again for the rest of my life, for the rest of my life. The note I made for myself here is I said, I didn't know I needed this poem until I realized there were years of very expensive therapy hidden inside these few words. Now, it's not that therapy's not great, but wouldn't it be interesting? A therapist could give you that poem. What a practical thing that could be. Give you that poem, and then you could spend a lot of time talking about that. Okay, let's keep cooking. Now, we're going to get to a poet that I do know, that I've loved for a long time, that we just lost. Speaking of lost, not too many years ago. His name is W.S. Merwin, just an amazing poet, but I'd never heard this poem. So I found this poem. This was something that got thrust onto my path this week. And I got to tell you, I did not avoid it. I read it. Okay. To the new year. Oh, and I also thought this was particularly relevant because of the time of year that it is. We're just a few days away from New Year 2023. Okay, The New Year by W.S. Merwin. With what stillness at last you appear in the valley. Now, you imagine he's speaking to the new year, okay? So he's addressing the new year. With what stillness at last you appear in the valley. Your first sunlight reaching down to touch the tips of a few high leaves that do not stir, as though they had not noticed, and did not know you at all. Then the voice of a dove calls from far away in itself to the hush of the morning. So this is the sound of you. So this is the sound of you here and now, whether or not anyone hears it. This is where we have come. This is where we have come with our age, our knowledge, such as it is, and our hopes, such as they are. So this is the sound of you here. So this is the sound of you here. And now, whether or not anyone hears it, this is where we have come. This is where we have come with our age, our knowledge, such as it is, and our hopes, such as they are. Again, I have known this poet, W.S. Merwin, for a long time, but I didn't know this poem. How exciting, how wonderful to find a new poem. And what would I have done if I hadn't found this poem, this little piece to balance all the breathless chatter at this time of year, about the new year, the kind of breathless, usually it's trying to sell you something. But there are balancing things that you can do, like read this poem, To the New Year by W.S. Merwin. Okay, last poem, also a poet that I absolutely love and have known of for many years, know many of her poems. In my book on poetry and leadership, I featured one of her poems, and her name is Naomi Shihab Nye. And I actually was introduced to Naomi through a mutual friend. And I've gotten to correspond with her and gotten to know her a little bit over the years. And she's just a delightful human being, in addition to being a skilled poet, an award-winning poet and teacher. And this poem is called Trying to Name What Doesn't Change. Naomi Shihab nigh. Roselva says the only thing that doesn't change is train tracks. She's sure of it. She's sure of it. The train changes, or the weeds that grow up spidery by the side, but not the tracks. But not the tracks. I've watched one of 3 years, she said. I've watched one for 3 years, she says, and it doesn't curve, doesn't break, doesn't grow. Peter isn't sure. Peter isn't sure. He saw an abandoned track near Sabinas, Mexico, and says, a track without a train is a changed track. The metal isn't shiny anymore. The wood was split, and some of the ties were gone. Every Tuesday on Morales Street, butchers crack the necks of 100 hens. The widow in the tilted house spices her soup with cinnamon. Ask her what doesn't change. Ask her what doesn't change. Stars explode. Stars explode. The rose curls up as if there is fire in the petals. The rose curls up as if there is fire in the petals. The cat who knew me is buried under the bush. The train whistle still wails its ancient sound. The train whistle still wails its ancient sound. But when it goes away, shrinking back from the walls of the brain, it takes something different with it every time. Every Tuesday on Morales Street, butchers crack the necks of 100 hens. The widow in the tilted house spices her soup with cinnamon. Ask her what doesn't change. Stars explode. The rose curls up as if there is fire in the petals. The cat who knew me is buried under the bush. The train whistle still wails its ancient sound, but when it goes away, shrinking back from the walls of the brain, it takes something different with it every time. Again, as I've said so many times and explored so many times, but I think it's so important. A good poem, a skillful poem, a delicious poem invites us in to have our own experience. It goes so deep into the personal that it comes out into the universal. Let me repeat that. It goes so deep into the specific and the personal that it comes out into the universal. And we get to feel it. We get to step inside that poem and have our own experience. You, me, we get to step inside the poem. And even if we don't get it, if we don't get every line of the poem, or we say to ourselves, well, I don't know what that means, that's okay. What is the feeling that is left in your body after you finish reading a poem? That is the critical part. What is the feeling? Now, of course, there's also insight and remembering and all sorts of things. I've talked about all of that on this podcast. Poems do so many things for us: practical, ethereal, specific, general. They do so many different things. And, I thought to myself when I read this poem, especially the last stanza, the train whistle still wails its ancient sound. Can you hear it? Can you hear it as those words come at you? As you step into the poem, the train whistle still wails its ancient sound, but when it goes away, shrinking back from the walls of the brain, it takes something different with it every time, every time. So what does that whistle take? We don't know. But yet we do know. We know that image stays with us. We know what that whistle takes. Okay. Well, that's a wrap. We're at the end of this particular edition of the podcast. And you see my little paradoxical thing going on here, that you can safely ignore as much poetry, only, let me say it that way, only so much poetry before we get into trouble, because we miss something critical. We miss something for our hearts. We miss something for our heads. We miss something for our body, something critical. So yes, we can ignore poetry, but only so much and for so long. I wouldn't take too many chances if I were you. And the answer of how much is personal, of course. That's the note I made. That's what I believe. For me, I'm hopeless. I'm hopeless. You know, I can only ignore poetry for short stretches of time, and then I've got to have a hit. I've got to have some. And I hope you've found in this episode today, I hope you found at least one of these poems that calls to you, as Mary Oliver says, calls to you like the wild geese, harsh and exciting. I hope you found at least one of these poems that calls to you, and um, and that you found one that you may want to hide away because you don't want to be, you don't want to be accused of being too much, of a poetry lover. Maybe in the circles that you run in, that wouldn't be cool. I don't know. And I'm being a little silly here, of course, but I'm also making a serious point that, we don't have to, you don't have to read poetry every day, although, I mean, why not? But of course, you don't have to read poetry every day. But I do think it's important to have at least some good poetry. When I say good, good that you love, that you walk inside, have your own experience, good that's practical for you, that does something for you. I think it's important to not ignore that level of poetry. That's my belief. Okay. So I said it was a wrap, but now I'm really going to say it is a wrap. And as always, thank you so much for your listening here. Thank you so much for being here. And I always love to, if you have comments or you want to get in touch with me, then of course, let me know. If there's poems that you love that you'd like me to cover, let me know that as well. Pass it along to other people. And as I always say, until next time and next poems, take good care of yourself.